the unspeakable horrors of the Donner Party. They left Springfield, Illinois, in the middle of April 1846, when the prairie grass was still wet and the redbud trees had not yet lost their blossoms. There were 32 of them at the start, the Donner brothers, George and Jacob, with their wives and children, James Reed, a prosperous furniture maker with a sharp temper and a pocket compass, and a collection of hired hands, single men, and families with names like Breen, Graves, Murphy, and Eddy. They called themselves the Donner Party because George Donner was the oldest, the wealthiest, the one with the most to lose. But in those first weeks, they were just another wagon train rolling west on the California Trail, singing "Oh, Susanna" around campfires, telling stories of golden orchards and warm valleys where a man could grow fat on land that cost nothing. The journey from the Missouri River to California was supposed to take 4 months. They had read the guidebooks, Lansford Hastings's The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California most of all. Hastings promised a new route, a shortcut that would shave 350 miles off the trail. It cut south of the Great Salt Lake, then angled west across the Utah Desert and through the Wasatch Mountains, rejoining the main trail near the Humboldt River. Hastings had never taken a wagon train that way. He had ridden it alone on horseback in good weather. But he wrote with the swagger of a man who had never seen a wagon axle snap or a child cry from thirst. And the Donner Party believed him because they wanted to believe. By July, they had reached Fort Laramie, then the Little Sandy River where the trail forked. The main route went northwest to Fort Hall. The Hastings cutoff went south toward the Salt Flats. A man named James Kleiman, who had just come the other way, met the Donner Party at the fork and told them not to take the cutoff. He said it was hell. He said the Wasatch Mountains would tear their wagons apart. He said there was no water for 60 miles across the desert. James Reed argued with him. Reed had read Hastings's book twice. He had marked the maps himself. He said Kleiman was a coward and that shortcuts were for men with vision. George Donner, placid and easily swayed, sided with Reed. The vote was not unanimous, but it was enough. They turned south, 73 people in 23 wagons, and the horizon swallowed them, the cutoff. The first sign that something was wrong came at the head of the Humboldt River. Hastings had promised a broad, smooth road through a green valley. Instead, they found a parched wasteland of alkali dust and sagebrush. The trail little more than a set of ruts left by the wagons that had already tried and failed. The donkeys began to die. The oxen lost their shoes on the sharp rocks. Children developed sores on their arms from the bitter water. They found a note from Hastings stuck in a cleft stick, telling them to camp and wait for him to return from scouting ahead. They waited 8 days. Hastings did not come back. When they finally moved forward, they found a canyon so narrow that they had to lower the wagons with ropes, one by one, while the women held the children back from the edge. The desert beyond the Great Salt Lake was worse than Kleiman had said. The oxen had not drunk for 2 days. The milk dried up in the cows' udders. A man named John Snyder, driving the Reed family wagon, whipped the animals until their hides split, and the oxen fell in their yokes, tongues black and swollen. James Reed, whose temper had been simmering for weeks, pulled a knife. Snyder called him a liar and a coward. Reed drove the blade between Snyder's ribs. The man fell face down in the dust, and the blood soaked into the alkali like water into sand. They held a trial in the desert. There were no judges, no lawyers, only exhausted men with sunburned faces and the smell of death in their nostrils. They decided that Reed should be banished, sent ahead on foot to California alone, without food or weapon. His wife Margaret begged them to reconsider. She stood in the middle of the circle with her children clinging to her skirts, and she said, "If you send him away, we will die." They sent him anyway. He walked into the white horizon, and no one expected to see him again. The snow line. By the end of October, they had reached the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada. The pass that would later bear their name, Donner Pass, was still open, barely. The first snow fell on the night of October 28th, a light dusting that melted by noon. The next day, a second storm came down from the north, colder and heavier. The trail disappeared. The oxen could not pull the wagons through drifts that rose to their bellies. George Donner, who had been riding in a wagon after a splinter from a broken axle had gashed his hand, looked out at the white wall ahead and said, "We'll never get over now." They made camp where they could. The Donner family and the Reeds, now led by Margaret, with her 3 children and a hired teamster named Walter Heron, settled on the north side of the pass, near a frozen lake that would later be called Donner Lake. The Breens, the Murphys, the Eddies, and the Graves family made camp on the south side, along Alder Creek. They built lean-tos and cabins from pine logs, chinking the gaps with moss and mud. The roofs were covered with hides and canvas wagon tops. The floors were dirt. The chimneys were sticks and mud, and they smoked so badly that the children's eyes ran with tears every evening. There were 81 people now. Some had joined along the trail, families who had taken the cutoff after them and caught up. They had food enough for 2 weeks if they rationed carefully. They had cattle that could be slaughtered for meat, but the cattle were thin, and the hides had been eaten down to the hair. They had flour, beans, sugar, and a few barrels of pickled pork. They had no idea that the snow would fall for 4 months. The first month, November, passed in a gray blur of hunger and cold. The storms came one after another, sometimes 3 in a week, piling snow so deep that the cabin doors could not be opened until the men dug them out from inside. The cattle died first, not from slaughter but from exposure, their legs freezing solid as they stood in the drifts. The men butchered them where they fell, carving frozen meat with axes and hauling it back to the cabins on sleds made from split barrel staves. For a few weeks, they ate well enough. Then the cattle were gone, and they ate the hides. You have to understand what it meant to eat a hide. The ox hides had been used as roofing, so they were stiff and brittle, coated with dried mud and pine pitch, and the frozen urine of the animals that had died beneath them. The women boiled them for days, until the leather softened into a brown glue that smelled like burnt hair. They scraped off the hair with knives, then cut the hide into strips and boiled it again. The result was a gelatinous soup with no flavor and no nutrition except the faintest trace of collagen. It sat in their stomachs like a stone. It did not keep them alive. The children stopped crying first. Then they stopped moving. Then they stopped waking up. Mary Graves's baby girl, born on the trail in August, died in her arms on November 15th. Margaret Reed's youngest, little Patty, lay in a corner of the cabin with her eyes open, too weak to blink. The adults gave their portions to the children, then gave half of what remained, then gave everything. By the end of November, George Donner's hand had turned black from the splinter wound. The The flesh had rotted while he slept, and the smell filled the cabin. His wife, Tamsin, cut away the dead tissue with the sewing scissors while he bit down on a leather strap. There was no medicine, no clean water, no way to stop the infection. She wrapped the hand in a rag and prayed. The forlorn hope. On December 16th, a group of 15 of the strongest remaining, 7 men, 5 women, and 3 boys, decided to walk out of the mountains. They would cross the pass on snowshoes, made from oxbows and rawhide, carrying nothing but a rifle, a few pounds of dried meat, and a blanket each. They called themselves the Forlorn Hope, which is an old military term for a suicide mission. They knew they might not make it. They knew that if they stayed, they would certainly die. The leader was a man named William Eddy. He had lost his wife and both children already. His son, James, had died on the trail, and his daughter, Margaret, had frozen to death in the cabin while he held her. He had nothing left to lose. The others included Patrick Breen, a grim Irish farmer who kept a diary of the snowfall; Sarah Foster, a young widow who had seen her husband die of starvation 3 weeks earlier; and a boy named Lemuel Murphy, 15 years old, who had not eaten solid food in 9 days. They left at dawn. The snow was so deep that the first man broke trail for 20 yards, then fell back, and the next man took his place. They covered less than a mile in the first 6 hours. By nightfall they had climbed to the ridge above the lake, and the wind had frozen the sweat on their faces into masks of ice. They dug a hole in the snow and huddled together like animals, pressing their feet into each other's stomachs for warmth. Someone sobbed. No one remembered who. They crossed the summit on the second day. The pass was a white ocean, the peaks of the Sierra rising around them like waves frozen in mid-crash. There was no trail, no landmark, no sign that any human being had ever been there before. They walked by the sun when they could see it, by the stars when they could not. On the third day they ran out of food. They ate the moccasins they had made from rawhide. They ate the leather straps from the snowshoes. They ate a dead crow that one of the boys found frozen in a tree. By the 6th day, they were eating pine bark and boiling old bones. A man named Antonio, a Mexican herdsman who had joined the party at the last minute, lay down in the snow and refused to get up. He said he was tired. He said he would rest for a while. They covered him with a blanket and walked on. He did not follow. On the 8th day, 3 of the men, Franklin Graves, his son-in-law Jay Fosdick, and a man named William Foster, went ahead to scout a route down the western slope. They found a deer trail, then lost it. They found a frozen stream, then fell through the ice. They returned to camp that night with nothing but frostbite. Graves, who was 65 years old, sat apart from the others and did not speak. He died in his sleep. Now there were 12. Now there was no food at all the first meal. What happened next has been told in whispers for 170 years. The survivors told different stories at different times to different people. Some denied it to their graves. Others confessed on their deathbeds, with tears streaming down their faces. The truth is this: they ate the dead. The first body was Antonio's. He had been dead for 2 days, lying where they left him, wrapped in a blanket that had frozen stiff around him. William Eddy walked back alone and cut strips of flesh from the thighs and calves, working quickly because the coyotes were already circling. He brought the meat to camp wrapped in his shirt. No one asked what it was. They cooked it over a fire of pine cones and ate it in silence. Mary Ann Graves, the sister of the dead Franklin, ate a piece of her own father's flesh. She said later that she did not know it until after. She said it tasted like pork, but sweeter. She said she could not stop herself from taking a second piece. They ate the men who died the next day, Jay Fosdick, who had frozen to death in the night, and a young man named James Smith, who had simply stopped breathing. They ate them raw when they were too weak to build a fire. They ate the muscles and the organs, and when those were gone, the marrow from the long bones cracked open with rocks. A woman named Sarah Foster later wrote in a letter, "We did what we had to do. God forgive us." They did not kill anyone for food. This is important, and the survivors insisted on it for the rest of their lives. No one was murdered. No one was butchered while alive. But the line between starving and feeding is not a line at all. It is a slope, and they slid down it 1 inch at a time, telling themselves each time that this would be the last. The rescue. On January 18th, 1847, William Eddy stumbled into a Miwok village on the western side of the Sierra. He was alone. The other 10 members of the Forlorn Hope had died or been left behind too weak to walk. He had survived by eating the last of the human flesh 3 days earlier, and then, when that ran out, by chewing on his own leather belt. The Miwok women gave him acorn mush and warm water. He cried when he tasted it. Eddy found his way to a settlement called Sutter's Fort, where a Swiss immigrant named John Sutter, the same Sutter whose sawmill would later spark the gold rush, had a small ranch and a reputation for helping stranded immigrants. Eddy told him about the people trapped in the mountains. Sutter organized a rescue party of 7 men, including a California militiaman named John Greenwood and a Miwok guide whose name has been lost. They crossed the Sierra in February during a break in the storms, carrying flour and dried beef on pack mules. The first relief party reached the Donner Lake cabins on February 18th. The rescuers found 22 survivors huddled in 3 cabins, half of them too weak to stand. The floors were covered in filth. The walls were black with smoke and frost. A pot sat on the cold hearth, and inside the pot were pieces of boiled human liver. The rescuers did not ask whose. They took the children first. Margaret Reed's 3, a girl named Patty, and a boy named Tommy, and an infant named Francis, who had been born in the cabin during the worst of the storms. They strapped the children to the pack mules and walked them out through snow that came to their waists. 3 more children died on that crossing. The second relief party arrived in March. They found more survivors, but also evidence of things that the first party had been too horrified to describe. In the Murphy cabin, the rescuers found a man named Louis Keseberg lying on a pile of rags, covered in blood, alone among scattered human bones. Keseberg had been one of the strongest men in the party. Now he was barely alive. He told the rescuers that he had eaten the bodies of his companions because they were dead, and he was hungry. He said he had not killed anyone. He said this over and over, as though saying it would make it true. The rescuers found Tamsin Donner's body in a corner of the cabin, partially dismembered. Keseberg said she had died of starvation. He said he had found her that way. No one believed him, but no one could prove otherwise. What they left behind. Of the 81 people who entered the Sierra in October 1846, 45 survived. 36 died. The causes of death were hunger, exposure, accident, and, in at least 2 documented cases. Murder. A man named William Foster, after returning to the cabins from the Forlorn Hope expedition, shot and killed 2 Miwok guides whom he suspected of stealing food. He was never prosecuted. The survivors returned to California and tried to rebuild their lives. Margaret Reed's husband, James, who had been banished in the desert, had reached Sutter's Fort months earlier and had been searching for his family ever since. He found them in a hospital in Sacramento, his 3 children alive, but his wife so thin that he did not recognize her. They lived together in San Jose until James died in 1874. Margaret died in 1878. They never spoke of the mountains. Patrick Breen, the Irish farmer who kept the diary, survived with his entire family. His journal, written in pencil on loose sheets of paper, is the only first-hand account of the winter. It records the weather, the deaths, the dwindling food supply, and nothing else. Breen never wrote the word cannibalism. He never described what they ate. He wrote on March 1st, 1847. Mrs. Murphy says the others have taken to eating the dead. I do not wish to know more. William Eddy, the leader of the Forlorn Hope, remarried and had more children. He became a carpenter in Santa Cruz and died in 1859 of a heart attack. On his deathbed, he told a priest that he had seen his daughter's ghost in the snow every night for 12 years. She asked me why I left her, he said. I tell her I didn't leave. I tell her I carried her with me, but she doesn't believe me. Tamsin Donner, the wife of George, was 45 years old when she died in the Murphy cabin. She was a former school teacher from North Carolina, well-read and fiercely independent. Throughout the winter, she had kept a small library of books in her trunk: Shakespeare, Milton, a Bible, and a volume of Byron's poetry. She read aloud to the children in the evenings, even when her husband's hand was rotting, even when the food was gone. She recited the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner from memory while the wind screamed outside. The rescuers found her trunk empty. The books had been torn apart, the pages eaten one by one, because paper has fiber, and fiber can be chewed. The final page of the Byron volume was gone. No one knows which poem it was. The Unspoken Shape of Hunger. It is easy to look at the Donner Party and see only a horror story, a cautionary tale about pride and bad decisions and the merciless indifference of winter. But that is not the whole truth. The whole truth is harder to hold in your mind because it has no moral and no lesson and no comfort at the end. The truth is that most of the people who died did not die of starvation. They died of hope. They gave their food to their children. They walked ahead into the snow to scout a route that they knew would kill them because staying still felt like surrender. They lay down in the drifts not because they were weak, but because they were tired. And being tired seemed, in that moment, like a perfectly good reason to stop. The human body in the final stages of starvation produces a kind of euphoria, a warm, drifting peace that feels like falling asleep in front of a fire. The Donner Party diaries describe it again and again. I feel no pain now, wrote a man named Samuel Shoemaker on the day he died. Only a great quiet. The other truth is that the cannibalism was not the worst part. The worst part was the week before the cannibalism, when they were still alive and still hungry, and still trying not to look at each other as food. That was the unspeakable horror. Not the eating, but the thinking about eating. The long, cold night, when a father realizes that his daughter's arm looks like a chicken leg. The moment when a mother catches herself measuring her baby's thigh with her eyes. The shame that follows, deeper than any shame you have ever felt, because it comes not from an action, but from an instinct, and you cannot cut an instinct out of yourself, no matter how sharp the knife. Patrick Breen's diary records the weather and the deaths. It does not record that on February 4th, he wrote a single sentence, then crossed it out so heavily that modern imaging cannot read what it said. He wrote something, then he erased it, then he wrote, "We are all alive." That crossed out sentence is the truest document of the Donner Party. It is the thing they could not say. It is the thought that lived in every cabin, every night, for 4 months, and it is still there, buried under the ink, waiting for someone to read it. The lake and the meadow you can visit Donner Pass today. It is a place of tourist cabins and ski lodges and a small state park with a bronze plaque that lists the names of the dead. The lake is still there, blue and cold, ringed with pine trees that have grown back after the logging. In the summer, families picnic on the shore. Children throw sticks into the water and watch the ripples spread. They do not know that the bottom of the lake is littered with oxen bones and broken wagon wheels and the brass buttons from a woman's coat. The Donner Memorial Museum stands on a hill overlooking the pass. Inside there is a diorama of the cabins built to scale, with tiny clay figures of the emigrants huddled around a tiny clay fire. There is a piece of rawhide that once belonged to George Donner, preserved under glass. There is a doll that belonged to one of the children, its cloth face still smudged with dirt. There is a letter written by Tamsin Donner to her sister back in Illinois, never sent, found in the snow the following spring. It reads in part, "Weiner, do not think too harshly of us. We meant only to find a better life. If we do not see each other again in this world, I will look for you in the next. There, I am told, the snow never falls." The letter is dated October 29th, 1846, the day before the first storm. The children who survived. Of the 45 survivors, the ones who lived longest were the children. They were young enough to forget, or young enough to learn how to pretend. Patty Reed, Margaret's daughter, was 8 years old when she walked out of the mountains with the first relief party. She grew up to be a school teacher in San Jose, a plump woman with gray hair and a gentle laugh. She never told her students where she had been, but when she was old, very old, she wrote a small memoir for her grandchildren. In it, she described the night her father was banished. She described the taste of boiled oxhide. She described the day the rescuers came and how the man who carried her on his back smelled of smoke and sweat, and underneath that, the faint sweetness of pine. She did not describe the other thing. She wrote around it the way you walk around a hole in the floor. She wrote, "We ate what we could find." And then she wrote about the spring wildflowers. Her grandchildren read the memoir and thought it was a sad story about a hard winter. They did not understand that the hole in the floor was the whole point of the room. The last survivor of the Donner Party was a girl named Eliza Donner, George and Tamsin's youngest daughter. She was 3 years old when the snow fell. She had no memory of the winter, or so she claimed. In 1911, she published a book called The Expedition of the Donner Party and Its Tragic Fate. It is a careful, measured account, full of dates and names and respectful silences. In the final chapter, she writes about visiting the site of the cabins as an old woman, 65 years after the fact. She writes that she stood on the shore of the lake and felt Nothing. No chill, no shadow, no whisper of the past. The place was beautiful, she wrote. The mountains were green. I thought of my mother and father, and I was glad that they had seen this view before the snow came. She died in 1922 at the age of 79. On her deathbed, she spoke in her sleep. The nurses wrote down some of what she said because it was unusual and they were curious. She said, "The fire is so warm, Mama. Come sit by the fire." She said, "I saved you a piece." She said, "It doesn't hurt anymore." She never said what the piece was. The histories we write. There have been dozens of books about the Donner Party. The first was published in 1848, barely a year after the rescue, by a newspaperman named Edwin Bryant, who had never been to the mountains. It was full of errors and exaggerations and moralistic lectures about the dangers of pride. It sold very well. The most famous book is George R. Stewart's Ordeal by Hunger, published in 1936. Stewart was a professor of English at the University of California, Berkeley, and he approached the Donner Party as a literary problem. How to tell a story that had no hero, no villain, no redemption arc, only a sequence of terrible choices made by people who were neither saints nor monsters, but simply human. Stewart interviewed the last surviving descendants, read the diaries, walked the trail. His conclusion was bleak. "There is no lesson here," he wrote. "Only the fact that human beings can endure more than they believe possible, and that the cost of endurance is sometimes everything they were." In 2010, a team of archaeologists excavated the site of the Alder Creek cabins. They found fragments of bone, buttons, nails, and a single child's moccasin. They also found a human tooth, a molar from an adult, cracked in half. There were cut marks on the tooth. The cut marks were made by a steel blade. The archaeologists published their findings in an academic journal, using words like perimortem trauma and taphonomic processes. They did not use the word cannibalism. They did not have to. The tooth said it for them, the alternative history. What if they had not taken the cut off? What if they had listened to James Kleiman? What if they had waited out the first storm on the eastern side of the Sierra, where the snow was shallower and the game was more plentiful? These are the questions that the survivors asked themselves for the rest of their lives. They asked them in the dark, in the hour before sleep, when the mind has no defenses. The answer is that most of them probably would have survived. The main trail through Truckee Pass was well known. Rescuers would have reached them within weeks. They would have lost some livestock, perhaps a few of the weaker children. They would have arrived in California in the spring of 1847, tired and thin but intact. They would have bought land, planted orchards, grown old. Their grandchildren would have visited them on summer afternoons, and no one would have written any books. And the name Donner would have meant nothing except a family of farmers who came west a long time ago. But that is not what happened. What happened was the cutoff, and the desert, and the murder, and the banishment, and the snow, and the hunger, and the eating, and the silence afterward. And because that is what happened, we cannot stop talking about it. We write the books and build the museums and stand in the snow ourselves, sometimes in the middle of winter, trying to understand how the world can be so beautiful and so cruel at the same time. The horror that has no name, there is a word for the thing they did. The word is anthropophagy. From the Greek anthropos, man, and phagein, to eat. The word is clinical and cold, designed to fit into a medical textbook. The survivors did not use it. They said, the unspeakable necessity. They said, what we had to do. They said, God, forgive us. The horror is not the word. The horror is the moment before the word, when you are sitting in a dark cabin with your children, sleeping beside you, and your husband's hand rotting in his lap, and the snow scratching at the door like a living thing. And you realize that the difference between you and the coyotes outside is not as wide as you thought. The horror is that you cannot stop thinking about the weight of a human thigh, the texture of human liver, the way a human rib cracks when you step on it. The horror is that after a while, the thoughts stop feeling like thoughts and start feeling like facts, and the facts stop feeling like horrors and start feeling like the weather. Something that happens, something you endure, something you do not bother to name. Tamsin Donner wrote a letter to her sister that she never sent. In it she said, "The children ask for bread. I have no bread. I have only the memory of bread, which is worse than nothing. George says we must not lose hope. I love George, but hope is a luxury we cannot afford. We have only each other and the snow and the dark. That is enough. That is more than enough." She folded the letter and put it in her trunk, next to the Shakespeare and the Byron. She did not write again. The snow does not forget. In the spring of 1847, after the last survivors had been carried out, a group of soldiers from Sutter's Fort went up to the cabins to bury the dead. They found 36 bodies in various stages of disassembly. They burned the cabins to the ground, then covered the ashes with rocks. They said a prayer. They walked away. The snow melted. The grass grew back. The bones sank into the soil. The lake thawed and froze and thawed again. The coyotes came and went. The pine trees added rings. The world forgot. But the world does not really forget. The world stores things in places you would not expect, in the rings of trees, in the layers of lake sediment, in the DNA of the coyotes' descendants. In 2018, a team of scientists took core samples from the bottom of Donner Lake. They found high levels of nitrogen and phosphorus in the layers corresponding to the winter of 1846 to 1847. The nitrogen came from decomposing human bodies. The phosphorus came from human bones. The lake had absorbed them, held them, made them part of itself. The Donner Party is still there, at the bottom of the lake, feeding the algae and the fish and the insects that skim across the surface in the summer twilight. You can drink the water if you want. They say it tastes like nothing. The final diary. Entry. Patrick Breen's diary ends on March 12, 1847. The first relief party had come and gone. The second relief party was on its way. Breen and his family were waiting, still alive, still hungry, still watching the horizon for the men who would carry them down. The last entry reads, "Snow nearly gone from the valley below. Saw a crow today. The first living thing besides ourselves in 3 months. Mrs. Breen says we will name our next child after it if it is a girl. I told her we have no next child. She laughed. I have not heard her laugh in so long. I'd forgotten what it sounded like, and it sounds like summer." He put down the pencil. He closed the diary. He went outside and stood in the sunlight, which he had not felt on his face since November. The snow was melting. Water ran down the rocks in thin streams. Somewhere below, in the green valley that led to California, a man was riding a mule up the trail, carrying flour and dried beef. and the news that the nightmare was almost over. Patrick Breen did not know that. He only knew that the sun was warm and that his wife had laughed and that the crow was still circling overhead, black against the blue, patient and indifferent and alive. He watched the crow until it disappeared over the ridge. Then he went back inside to tell the others that help was coming. He did not know if it was true. He did not know if help could ever truly come for people who had seen the things they had seen and done the things they had done. He only knew that the sun was warm, and that was enough for one day. What we carry. We tell the story of the Donner Party because we are afraid of it. We are afraid that we would do the same thing in their place. We are afraid that the line between civilization and savagery is not a line at all but a smudge, and that we are already standing on the wrong side of it without knowing. We tell the story to reassure ourselves that we would never let it go that far. We would never eat human flesh. We would never abandon our neighbors. We would never drive a knife into a man's chest in the middle of the desert because he called us a liar. But we do not know. We cannot know. That is the real horror of the Donner Party. Not what they did, but what they reveal about us. They were ordinary people. They were farmers and merchants and school teachers and children. They loved their families. They prayed to God. They sang songs around campfires. And then the snow came and the food ran out. And the ordinary became extraordinary in the worst possible way. We like to think that we are different. We like to think that we would rise to the occasion, that our better angels would prevail, that we would share our last crust of bread and die with dignity. But the Donner Party thought that too. Every one of them thought that. And then the snow came. So we tell the story. We tell it in books and museums and history classes and campfire tales. We tell it to our children, carefully edited, with the worst parts left out. We tell it to ourselves in the middle of the night when we cannot sleep. We tell it because telling is a form of magic, a way of keeping the horror at arm's length, a way of saying that was then and this is now, and we are safe, but we are not safe. We have never been safe. The snow is always coming. The food always runs out. The line always blurs. And the only thing we can do, the only thing any of us can do, is to hold on to each other for as long as we can and hope that when the dark comes, we will be brave enough to face it without becoming something we cannot forgive. The Donner Party faced that dark. Some of them broke, some of them held. Most of them did both in different measures on different days. They were not heroes. They were not villains. They were people, and they died, and we remember them not because they were exceptional, but because they were not. And that is the unspeakable horror. That is the truth that Patrick Breen crossed out in his diary, the truth that Tamsin Donner carried in her trunk, the truth that the lake still holds in its cold, clear water. They were us. We are them. And the snow does not care which is which.